Hey, welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about the hardware and software requirements for running Exchange Server 2016. Now, before I get started, I need to point out that at the time that this video is being recorded, Exchange 2016 is brand new. That being the case, Microsoft is still establishing all of the requirements, guidance, and best practices, and those are probably going to evolve for a while. But they have established a page on TechNet that lists the latest requirements, and I've provided a link to that page right here. So I would recommend going and checking that page out before you attempt to install Exchange Server 2016. So let's talk about the hardware requirements first. First thing you're going to need is a 64-bit CPU. You can use Intel 64, which was formerly known as EM64T. You can use AMD 64 or Itanium IA 64. Now, as memory goes, if you're running the mailbox server role, you're going to need a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM. If you're running the edge transport role, you're going to need 4 gigs. So keep in mind these are minimums, so you may end up needing more memory, especially on the mailbox server. 8 gigs probably isn't going to be enough to run Exchange in a production environment. Also, the page file. The page file needs to be set to the physical RAM amount plus 10 megabytes. Now, this holds true up to 32 gigabytes. So once you get past that 32 gigabyte threshold, then you don't have to worry about making the page file increasingly larger. Microsoft recommends a display resolution of 1024 by 768 or higher. I would recommend or higher because there are some things that just feel a little bit cluttered on the screen if you don't use a higher display resolution. And then there are some miscellaneous hardware components that you might end up needing, things like a DVD drive or a network drive to be able to load the installation media, maybe a keyboard or a mouse, and things like that. Now, there are also some storage requirements that you need to be aware of. First, you're going to need at least 30 gigs of space on the drive on which you install Exchange. Typically, this is going to be your C drive, but not always. You don't have to install Exchange to the C drive. You can put it somewhere else if you like. You're also going to need 200 megs of available disk space on the system drive. This is in addition to the 30 gig requirement. So in other words, if you install Exchange to the system drive, then you're going to need 30 gigabytes plus 200 megabytes. If you install Exchange somewhere else, then you'll need 200 megs of space on the system drive and 30 gigs of space on whatever drive you install Exchange to. Now, there are a few additional requirements. For example, you're going to need 500 megs of space for every unified messaging language pack that you install. You're also going to need 500 megs of free space for the message queue database. Now, storage planning and Exchange Server is something of a science. It can be very intricate to determine all of the storage requirements. And at the time that this video is being recorded, Microsoft hasn't released full-blown storage guidance yet. So my recommendation would be if you need to perform storage planning for databases and things like that, I would recommend checking to see if the Exchange 2016 guidance is out yet. And if it's not, then I would refer to the Exchange 2013 guidance because the storage requirements aren't likely to change all that much. Now, we also need to talk about file systems. Now, typically, Exchange Server is installed using the NTFS file system. I mean, after all, NTFS has been Microsoft's standard file system for at least 20 years. But NTFS isn't the only option because in Windows Server 2012, Microsoft introduced the REFS file system. But you can't use REFS for everything. You're going to have to use NTFS for the system partition and for partitions that store Exchange binary files or files generated by Exchange Diagnostic Logging. Now, you can use either REFS or NTFS, your choice, for partitions containing transaction logs, databases, and content indexing files, so long as those disks don't contain anything else. And of course, Exchange Server 2016 has some operating system requirements. Exchange 2016 can be installed on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, and you can install it on Standard Edition or Data Center Edition. Now, you'll notice that Windows Server 2016 isn't on the list. At the time that this video is being recorded, Windows Server 2016 hasn't been released yet. Now, you don't have to use Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 if all you're installing is the management tools, although the management tools can certainly be installed on Windows Server operating systems. The management tools can run on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, Standard or Data Center Edition, or you can also run them on a 64-bit edition of Windows 10 or Windows 8.1. One last component that you're going to need from an operating system perspective is version 4.5.2 of the .NET framework. So, what about supported versions of Microsoft Outlook? Well, one of the aspects of upgrading to a new version of Exchange that tends to throw administrators a curveball from time to time is that not every version of Exchange supports every version of Outlook, and Exchange 2016 is no exception. So, Exchange 2016 supports Outlook 2016, Outlook 2013, and Outlook 2010 so long as it has this patch installed, the KB2965295. Now, if your Office uses Macs, no problem. You can use Outlook for Mac for Office 365 or Outlook for Mac 2011. There are also some Active Directory requirements because Exchange Server is completely dependent upon the Active Directory in order to function. You can't even install Exchange onto a server that's not domain joined. So the requirements that you need to be aware of are that every domain controller in your entire forest has to be running a supported version of Windows Server. So what versions are supported? Well, you can see them listed right here. We have Windows Server 2008 Standard Enterprise or Data Center Edition, Windows Server 2008 R2 Data Center RTM or later, Windows Server 2008 R2 Standard or Enterprise Edition. Then we have Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 Standard or Data Center Edition. Now, regardless of which operating system you use, the Active Directory Forest functional level has to be set at Windows Server 2008 or higher. Now, a few final notes regarding the Active Directory. I strongly recommend using 64-bit domain controllers if at all possible because they will improve Exchange Server's performance. Also, Exchange should only be installed onto member servers. You can't install Exchange onto a domain controller. Well, I say that, but in previous versions of Exchange, Microsoft blocked you from installing Exchange onto a domain controller. I'm honestly not sure if Microsoft blocks Exchange Server 2016 from being installed on a domain controller, but doing so would violate a number of best practices, so you definitely shouldn't do it if the software does happen to allow it. Also, DNS namespace is supported in contiguous, non-contiguous, single label domain, or disjoint format. And one last note is that IPv6 is only supported if IPv4 is also installed. So there's a dependency on IPv4. You can't use Exchange Server without it. So that's going to do it for this video. I'm going to come back in the next video and talk about some of the things that are new in Exchange Server 2016.